The T-34 was a Soviet medium tank that had a profound and lasting effect on the field of tank design. At its introduction, the T-34 possessed an unprecedented combination of firepower, mobility, protection, and ruggedness. Its 76.2mm high-velocity tank gun provided a substantial increase in firepower over any of its contemporaries. Its heavy sloped armor was difficult to penetrate by most contemporary anti-tank weapons. When first encountered in 1941, the German tank general von Kleist called it the finest tank in the world. Although its armor and armament was surpassed later in the war, it has often been credited as the most effective, efficient, and influential tank design of the Second World War. The T-34 was the mainstay of Soviet armored forces throughout the Second World War. Its design allowed it to be continuously refined to meet the constantly evolving needs of the Eastern Front. As the war went on, it became more capable, but also quicker and cheaper to produce. Soviet industry would eventually produce over 80,000 T-34s of all variants, allowing steadily greater numbers to be fielded as the war progressed, despite the loss of thousands in combat against the German Wehrmacht. Replacing many light tanks and medium tanks in the Red Army service, it was the most produced tank of the war, as well as the second most produced tank of all time, after its successor, the T-54-55 series. Its development led directly to the T-54 and the T-55 series of tanks, which in turn evolved into the later T-62, T-72, and T-90 that formed the armoured mainstay of many modern armies. The T-34 variants were widely exported after World War II, and as late as 1996 were still in service in at least 27 countries. In 1939, the most numerous Soviet tank models were the T-26 infantry tank and the BT series of fast tanks. The T-26 was slow-moving, designed to keep pace with infantry on the ground. The BT tanks were cavalry tanks, fast-moving and light, designed for maneuver warfare. Both were Soviet developments of foreign designs from the early 1930s. The T-26 was based on the British Vickers 6-ton, and the BT tanks were based on a design from an American engineer, J. Walter Christie. In 1937, the Red Army had assigned engineer Mikhail Koshkin to lead a new team to design a replacement for the BT tanks at the Kharkiv Comintern locomotive plant. The prototype tank, designated A-20, was specified with 20mm of armor and 45mm in gun, and the new model V234 engine, using less flammable diesel fuel in a V12 configuration designed by Konstantin Shelpan. It also had an 8x6 wheel convertible drive, similar to the BT tank's 8x2, which allowed it to run on wheels without caterpillar tracks. This feature had greatly saved on maintenance and repair of the unreliable tank tracks of the early 1930s and allowed tanks to exceed 85 km per hour on roads, but gave no advantage in combat, and its complexity made it difficult to maintain. By 1937 to 1938, track design had improved and the designers considered it a waste of space, weight and maintenance resources, despite the road speed advantage. The A-20 also incorporated previous research, BTIS and BTSW2 projects into sloped armor. Its all-round sloped armor plates were more likely to deflect rounds than perpendicular armor. During the Battle of Lake Kazan in July 1938 and the battles of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, an undeclared border war with Japan on the frontier with occupied Manchuria, the Soviets deployed numerous tanks against the Imperial Japanese Army. Although the Imperial Japanese Army Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks had diesel engines, the Red Army's T-26 and BT tanks used petrol engines which, while common in tank designs at the time, often burst into flames when hit by the IGJA tank killer teams, using Molotov cocktails. Poor quality welds in the Soviet armor plates left small gaps between them, and flaming petrol from the Molotov cocktails easily seeped into the fighting and engine compartment. Portions of the armor plating that had been assembled with rivets also proved to be vulnerable. The Soviet tanks were easily destroyed by the Type 95's tank's 37mm gunfire, despite the low velocity of that gun, or at any other slightest provocation. The use of riveted armor led to a problem called spalling, whereby the impact of enemy shells, even if they failed to disable the tank or kill the crew on their own, would cause the rivets to break off and become projectiles inside the tank. After these battles, Koshkin convinced Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to let him develop a second prototype, a more heavily armed and armoured universal tank that reflected the lessons learned and could replace both the T-26 and the BT tanks. Koshkin named the second prototype A-32 after its 32mm of frontal armour. It had an L-10 76.2mm gun and the same model V2-34 diesel. Both were tested in field trials at Kubinka in 1939, with the heavier A-32 proving to be as mobile as the A-20. A still heavier version of the A-32 with 45mm of front armour, wider tracks and a newer L-11 76.2mm gun was approved for production as the T-34. Koshkin chose the name after the year 1934 when he began to formulate his ideas about the new tank. Valuable lessons from Lake Kazan and Khalkhin Gol regarding armour protection, mobility, quality welding and main guns were incorporated into the new T-34 tank, which represented a substantial improvement over the BT and T-26 tanks in all four areas. Koshkin's team completed two prototype T-34s in January 1940. In April and May, they underwent a grueling 2,000-kilometre drive from Kharkiv to Moscow for a demonstration for the Kremlin leaders to the Mannerheim line in Finland and back to the Kharkiv via Minsk and Kiev. Some drivetrain shortcomings were identified and corrected. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in its invasion of the Soviet Union on 22nd of June 1941. The existence of the T-34 proved a psychological shock to German soldiers who had expected to face an inferior enemy. The T-34 was superior to any tanks the Germans had in service then. Initially, the Wehrmacht had great difficulty destroying the T-34s in combat, as standard German anti-tank weaponry proved ineffective against its heavy, sloped armour. The diary of Alfred Jodl seems to express surprise at the appearance of the T-34 in Riga. At the start of the hostilities, the Red Army had 967 T-34 tanks and 508 KV tanks, concentrated in 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. In one of the first known encounters, a T-34 crushed a 37mm Pak-36, destroyed 2 Panzer IIs and left a 14-kilometre long swathe of destruction in its wake before a howitzer destroyed it at close range. The German standard's anti-tank gun, 37mm Pak-36, proved ineffective against the T-34. The Germans were forced to deploy 105mm field guns and 88mm anti-aircraft guns in direct fire rolls to stop them. Despite this, the Soviet Corps equipped with these new tanks lost most of them within weeks. The combat statistics for 1941 show that the Soviets lost on average over 7 tanks for every German tank lost. The Soviets lost a total of 20,500 tanks in 1941, approximately 2,300 of them T-34s, as well as over 900 heavy tanks, mostly KVs. The destruction of the Soviet tank force was accomplished not only by the glaring disparity in the tactical and operational skills of the opponents, but also by the mechanical defects that affected the Soviet armor pool. Beside this poor state of the older tanks, the new T-34s and KVs suffered from initial mechanical and design problems, particularly with regard to clutches and transmissions. Mechanical breakdowns accounted for at least 50% of the tank losses in the summer fighting, and recovery or repair equipment was not to be found. The shortage of repair equipment and recovery vehicles led the early T-34 crews to enter combat carrying a spare transmission on the engine deck. Other key factors diminishing the initial impact of the T-34s on the battlefield were the poor state of leadership, tank tactics, and crew training. These factors were partially consequences of Stalin's purges of the Soviet officer corps in 1937, reducing the army's efficiency and morale. This was aggravated as the campaign progressed by the loss of many of the properly trained personnel during the Red Army's disastrous defeats early in the invasion. Typical crews went into the combat with only their basic military training, plus 72 hours of classroom instruction, according to historian Stephen Zaloga. The weakness of mechanized corps lay not in the design of their equipment, but rather in its poor mechanical state, the inadequate training of their crews, and the abysmal quality of Soviet military leadership in the first month of the war. After this battle, the tank saw combat in a plethora of other battles and wars, including the Manchurian Campaign of August 1945 and the Korean War of 1950 to 1951. Many variants of the T-34 have been produced, such as the T-34-85 and the Su-85, a tank destroyer based on the T-34 chassis. As of 2015, the only known countries confirmed to be using the T-34 in active service are Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and North Korea. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. If you did like it, please give it a thumbs up, or if you didn't like it, dislike it, but at least tell me why in the comment section below, and subscribe if you want to see similar content to this in the future. Also, if you guys like health and fitness content, check out my Instagram channel. I've linked it down in the description below. Thanks so much, guys.